The wind tore through the mountain pass like something alive, and Alara Whitfield was already certain she would not survive the night. She pressed her back against the frozen wall of her cabin, listening to the storm scream against the shutters, when she heard it. A sound low and broken, half growl, half whimper, carried on the howling wind. She froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. No sane person went outside during a storm like this one, but the sound came again, weaker this time, and something in her chest refused to let it go unanswered. She grabbed the only lantern she owned, its flame trembling behind cracked glass, and pushed open her door against a wall of snow. The cold hit her like a fist. Her breath turned to ice the moment it left her lips. She should have gone back inside. Instead, she followed the sound, stumbling through drifts that reached her knees, her thin coat doing nothing against a cold that seemed to reach straight into her bones. She found them near the old fence line, 5 massive shapes half buried in snow, their fur crusted with ice, their sides barely rising and falling. Wolves. Enormous wolves, larger than any she had ever seen in these mountains, larger than any wolf had a right to be. Her first instinct screamed at her to run. Wolves killed livestock. Wolves killed people who wandered too far from their homes. But these wolves were not hunting. They were dying. One of them lifted its head as she approached, and its eyes met hers. They were a deep amber, glinting even in the darkness, and for one strange moment, she felt as though something intelligent looked back at her, something that understood exactly what kind of danger it was in. The wolf let out a soft, pained sound and lowered its head back into the snow, too weak to do anything else. Alara's mind raced through every warning her grandmother had ever given her about wild animals, about mountain storms, about the foolishness of a woman living alone. She thought of all of it in the space of a single breath, and then she thought of nothing at all, except the fact that 5 living creatures would freeze to death within the hour if she did nothing. She was already moving before she fully decided to. She grabbed the closest wolf under its front legs and pulled with everything she had. It was heavier than anything she had ever tried to lift, and the snow fought her at every step, but adrenaline gave her strength she did not know she had. She dragged the first wolf toward her cabin, then went back for the second, her arms burning, her lungs aching from the cold air. By the time she had pulled the 5th wolf through her narrow doorway, her hands had gone numb, and her legs shook so badly she could barely stand. She collapsed onto the floor beside them, 5 enormous bodies filling nearly every inch of her small home, their breathing shallow, their fur still crusted with frost. She had no idea what she had just done. She only knew she could not have done otherwise. Her cabin was small, 1 room with a stone hearth, a narrow bed, and a single window shuttered against the storm. The fire had burned low while she was outside, and she fed it quickly, coaxing the flames back to life with trembling hands. The heat began to fill the room, but it was not enough. The wolves needed more than warmth from a distance. They needed to be covered, to have the cold pulled out of their bodies before it stopped their hearts entirely. She looked at her bed, at the single blanket folded across it, the one her mother had woven for her years ago, the only thing of real value she owned. It was worn now, thinner than it used to be, but it was still warm, still soft, still hers. She thought of the winters she had wrapped herself in it, of the nights she had cried into it after her parents passed, of how it was the last piece of her mother she had left in the world. She picked it up anyway. The weakest of the 5 wolves lay closest to the fire, its breathing so faint she had to watch closely to see its chest move at all. She knelt beside it and draped the blanket over its trembling body, tucking the edges in the way her mother used to tuck blankets around her as a child. The wolf did not flinch away from her touch. It seemed, if anything, to lean into it, as though it recognized kindness even through the haze of near death. For the other 4, she used everything else she had. Old cloths, a spare shirt, even the rug from her floor, anything that might hold in a little warmth. She built the fire higher than she had in months, feeding it logs she had been rationing for the rest of the winter, logs she needed to survive herself. She did not think about tomorrow. She only thought about the shivering bodies scattered across her floor, and the fact that if she stopped now, they would not see morning. Hours passed. She lost track of how many. She sat close to the fire herself, her own body finally beginning to warm, watching the wolves for any sign of change. Slowly, so slowly she almost missed it, their breathing began to even out. The one wrapped in her mother's blanket let out a long breath and shifted, curling its body tighter, seeking more warmth rather than surrendering to the cold. She allowed herself a small, exhausted smile. They were going to live. It was near dawn when she finally let her eyes close, still sitting upright against the wall, too afraid to lie down in case one of them needed her. She woke sometime later to pale light filtering through the cracks in her shutters and the strange, disorienting realization that the room was warmer than it should have been, warmer than her small fire alone could account for. She opened her eyes to find all 5 wolves awake, watching her. Her breath caught. She had expected fear, aggression, the instinct of a cornered animal to lash out. Instead, the wolves simply watched her with an intensity that unsettled her more than any growl could have. Their eyes were too aware, too focused, following her every small movement as she shifted against the wall. The one with the amber eyes, the one she had wrapped in her mother's blanket, tilted its head slightly, almost as if it were studying her, the way a person might study someone they were trying to understand. "You're awake," she said softly, more to break the silence than anything else. Her voice sounded strange in the quiet cabin, small against the weight of 5 pairs of eyes fixed on her. None of the wolves moved. None of them growled or bared their teeth. They simply watched. She forced herself to stay calm, to move slowly, as she rose and checked the fire, added another log despite her dwindling supply, and glanced toward the small store of food she kept for herself. She had little enough as it was, barely enough to last her through the rest of the season, but the wolves needed to eat as much as they needed warmth. She had dried meat, tough and unappealing, saved for the hardest days of winter. She tore it into pieces and set it near each of them, keeping a careful distance even as her hands shook. The wolves ate cautiously, watching her the entire time, and when they finished, something strange happened. The largest of them, a wolf with a scar across its muzzle, and a presence that seemed to command the space around it more than the others, rose unsteadily to its feet, and limped toward the small pile of firewood stacked near her door. With visible effort, it nosed several pieces closer to the hearth, as though trying to help feed the very fire that had saved its life. Alara stared, stunned. She had never heard of wolves behaving this way, never read of it in any book, never heard of it in any story told around a village fire. Wild animals did not understand gratitude in ways she could recognize. They did not try to repay kindness. And yet here it was, unfolding in front of her, undeniable. She spent the rest of that day and the next tending to them, changing the position of her makeshift blankets, keeping the fire steady, feeding them what little she could spare from her stores. Slowly, their strength returned. The scars along their sides began to look less severe. Their breathing grew stronger, their movements more fluid. By the 3rd day, they were able to stand fully, to move around her small cabin with the careful grace of creatures regaining control of powerful bodies. Still, they did not leave. She began to wonder, in quiet moments when she caught one of them watching her a little too closely, whether these were truly wild animals at all. There was something in the way the amber-eyed wolf sat near her at night, close enough that she could feel its warmth but never close enough to feel threatened, that reminded her of something almost human, something patient, something protective. On the 4th night, the storm finally broke. She woke to silence outside her window, instead of howling wind, the first true quiet she had heard in days. She rose and pushed open her shutters to find the mountain blanketed in fresh, undisturbed snow, the sky above clear and sharp with stars. When she turned back into the room, the wolves were all awake again, watching her with that same strange intensity, as though waiting for something. "You're strong enough now," she said quietly, surprising herself with how much the words cost her. "You can go home, wherever that is." None of them moved. She sat back down near the fire, unsure what else to do, and one by one, the wolves settled around her rather than toward the door. The scarred one lay closest, its great head resting near her feet, in a gesture that felt deliberate, almost reverent. The amber-eyed one, still wrapped loosely in the corner of her mother's blanket, shifted until its body pressed lightly against her side, sharing warmth the way she had shared it days before. She did not understand what was happening, why 5 wild wolves would choose to stay in a cramped human cabin when the forest and freedom waited just beyond her door. But some instinct deep inside her, the same instinct that had pulled her out into a killing storm to save creatures that could have torn her apart, told her not to question it too closely. Whatever these wolves were, Whatever strange intelligence lived behind those watching eyes, they meant her no harm. She fell asleep that night surrounded by them, warmer than she had been in years, and for the first time since her parents had died, she did not feel entirely alone in the world. When she woke the next morning, the cabin was empty. The wolves were gone, vanished as silently as they had first appeared in the storm, leaving no trace behind except 5 slightly flattened patches on her floor and her mother's blanket, folded with an almost impossible neatness in the center of the room. She stood staring at it for a long moment, an unexpected ache rising in her chest, the strange sense of loss that comes from losing something you never quite understood you had. She told herself it was foolish to feel this way about wild animals, that they had simply healed and returned to the wild where they belonged. She told herself this while she picked up the blanket and pressed it to her face, breathing in a scent that was not quite hers, something wild and warm and strangely comforting. She told herself this while she stepped outside into the blinding white morning and found, pressed into the fresh snow leading away from her cabin, 5 sets of enormous paw prints heading toward the deep forest, and, strangely, what looked almost like a single human footprint beside them before the trail vanished into the trees entirely. She stood there for a long time, the cold biting at her cheeks, staring at that one impossible footprint until the wind finally erased it. Then she turned back toward her cabin, toward the life she had known before the storm, unaware that everything about that life was about to change forever. Word soon spread through the small village at the base of the mountain that something strange had happened during the great storm, though no one could say exactly what. A traveling trader mentioned seeing enormous wolf tracks near the old fence line, tracks far too large to belong to any wolf native to these mountains. An elderly woman swore she had seen shapes moving through the blizzard that were far too tall and strange to be simple animals. Ilara said nothing about what had truly happened in her cabin. Some secrets, she decided, were not meant to be shared, not until she understood them herself. Days passed, then a week, and slowly her life returned to its familiar rhythm. She gathered firewood, mended the small holes in her roof, traded what little she could spare for flour and salt at the village market. But something had shifted inside her, some quiet awareness that the world was larger and stranger than she had ever imagined, and that somewhere out in those vast, snow-covered mountains, 5 creatures she had saved were carrying a debt they clearly intended to repay. She did not know yet how right she was, or how far that debt would eventually take her. Nearly 2 weeks after the storm, strange things began appearing outside Ilara's door. The first morning, she found a neat stack of firewood, cut and split with more precision than her own tired arms could ever manage, piled exactly where her old stack had run dangerously low. She assumed at first that a kind neighbor had noticed her struggling and decided to help, though no one in the village had ever shown her that kind of quiet generosity before. She thanked whoever it might have been under her breath and carried the wood inside. The next morning, there was fresh meat, cleanly dressed and wrapped in broad leaves, far more than she could have hunted or afforded herself. Then came a small pouch of coins, left with no note, no explanation, tucked beneath a stone by her door, where only someone who knew exactly where to look would think to place it. She began to feel a prickling unease beneath her gratitude. Someone was watching her closely enough to know her needs before she voiced them, closely enough to know the exact stone she might check. She asked around the village, carefully, without revealing too much. No one admitted to leaving anything. A few neighbors looked at her with open confusion when she mentioned the firewood, the meat, the coins, as though she were speaking of things that could not possibly exist. One elderly man, known for his sharp eyes and sharper tongue, told her plainly that whoever was leaving gifts at her door was either deeply in love with her or deeply in her debt, and either way she should be careful, because debts of that size were rarely simple. Ilara laughed off his warning at the time, though his words lingered with her longer than she wanted to admit. She thought of the wolves often during those days, of the way the scarred one had nosed firewood toward her fire, of the strange human footprint she had found leading away from her cabin. She told herself it was impossible, that wolves could not carry coins or dress meat or stack wood with such careful precision. And yet the timing of it all felt too deliberate to be coincidence. One evening, as she returned from the village with a small basket of traded goods, she noticed fresh tracks circling the edge of her property, large paw prints pressed deep into the thin layer of remaining snow. Her heart quickened, though not entirely from fear. She followed the tracks a short distance into the tree line before they simply stopped, vanishing as though whatever made them had simply lifted into the air and disappeared. She stood there a long moment, scanning the shadows between the trees, certain she was being watched, though she saw nothing. "I know you're out there," she called softly into the darkening forest, feeling foolish even as the words left her mouth. "Whatever you are, thank you, for whatever it is you're doing." The forest gave her nothing but silence in return, yet she could not shake the feeling that somewhere among those trees, something had heard her, something that understood her words far better than any ordinary wolf ever could. Rumors began to travel through the village not long after, carried by merchants passing through on their way to more prosperous towns. They spoke, in hushed and careful tones, of the Alpha King, ruler of a distant and powerful pack territory, far to the north, a man of tremendous strength and equally tremendous mystery, who governed not just his own kind, but held quiet influence over human settlements as well, through alliances few dared to question. They spoke of his royal guard, a small circle of trusted generals, fierce enough that entire armies avoided their territory rather than risk confrontation. More curious still were the newer rumors, whispered with a mixture of confusion and awe, claiming that the king and his 4 generals had vanished from their northern territory during the Great Storm weeks earlier, and had not been seen since. Search parties had reportedly combed the mountains for any sign of them, finding nothing but a trail that led toward the very range where Alara's village sat, a trail that ended abruptly and without explanation. Alara listened to these stories with a growing unease she could not quite name. She told herself the connection was impossible, too fantastic to be real, the kind of story that belonged in the tales her mother used to tell her as a child, not in the ordinary, difficult life she actually lived. And yet she could not stop thinking about 5 wolves far larger than any natural wolf had a right to be, about eyes that seemed to understand her every word, about a debt that was clearly, deliberately, being repaid. It was nearly a month after the storm when the royal guard itself arrived in the village, a small but unmistakably imposing group of riders, bearing a crest she had never seen before, a wolf's head circled by a crown of silver thorns. The village buzzed with nervous excitement and fear in equal measure. Such visitors never came to a place this small, this poor, this far from anywhere of importance. Their arrival could only mean something significant, and significant things rarely came without cost. The riders questioned the villagers carefully, asking about strange sightings during the great storm, about anyone who might have offered shelter to travelers or animals during those brutal days. Alara's stomach twisted with every question she overheard, though she said nothing, kept her head down, and hoped desperately that whatever secret she was guarding would remain hidden a little longer. Her hope did not last. An older woman from the village, meaning no harm, mentioned in passing that young Alara Whitfield had gone missing from sight for several days during the worst of the storm, only to reappear looking exhausted and strangely protective of her small cabin. It was an innocent comment, offered without malice, but it was enough to draw the attention of the riders directly toward her modest home at the edge of the village. Alara was gathering water from the well when she noticed them approaching, 3 riders on tall, dark horses, their expressions unreadable beneath heavy winter cloaks. Her hands tightened around the handle of her bucket as they drew closer, every instinct urging her to run, even as reason told her that running would only make things worse. She forced herself to stand still, to meet their approach with whatever calm she could gather. The lead rider, a woman with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority, dismounted first. "We are searching for information regarding the storm 3 weeks past," she said, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We understand you may have offered shelter to travelers during that time." Alara's mind raced through a dozen possible answers, each one feeling more dangerous than the last. Lying to royal guards felt like inviting disaster, yet telling the full truth felt equally impossible. Too strange, too unbelievable to speak aloud without sounding as though she had lost her senses entirely. She settled, finally, on something close enough to the truth to feel honest, distant enough from the full story to feel safe. "I found some wolves during the storm," she said carefully. "They were injured, freezing. I helped them as best I could. They left once they had recovered." The riders exchanged a glance that told her, immediately, that her simple answer had confirmed something they had already suspected. The lead rider studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Ilara's worn coat, her calloused hands, the quiet strength in the way she held herself despite clear fear. 5 wolves, the rider said finally. It was not a question. Ilara's breath caught. Yes, she admitted, seeing no point in denying what they already seemed to know. Something shifted in the rider's expression then, something that might have been relief, might have been respect, might have been both at once. You have no idea what you have done, she said quietly, almost to herself, before turning back to her companions with a rapid series of instructions Ilara could not fully follow. Before Ilara could ask for any explanation, the riders were already preparing to leave, offering nothing more than a brief, formal thanks and an assurance that her kindness had been noted by those who mattered most. They rode away as swiftly as they had arrived, leaving her standing beside the well, bucket forgotten at her feet, her mind spinning with questions that had no answers. That night, she sat by her fire, long after the flames had died down to embers, staring at the folded blanket still resting where she had left it since the wolves' departure. Whatever she had stumbled into during that storm, it was clearly far larger and far more significant than a simple act of kindness toward frightened animals. She thought of the Alpha King, of his missing generals, of the timing that could not possibly be coincidence, and felt, for the first time since her parents had died, a genuine fear of what might be coming for her. She did not sleep well that night, her mind circling endlessly around amber eyes and silver crowns, and debts too large to fully understand, unaware that the true weight of what she had done was only beginning to unfold, and that the man at the very center of it all was already making his way toward her, determined to meet, in person, the woman who had saved not just 5 wolves, but the future of an entire kingdom. The man arrived at her door 3 days later, on foot, dressed plainly in a traveler's cloak that did nothing to disguise the quiet power in the way he carried himself. Ilara noticed it the moment she opened her door to find him standing there, snow dusting his dark hair, his expression carefully composed into something warm and unthreatening, though something beneath that warmth felt sharp, watchful, contained. "I'm sorry to trouble you," he said, his voice deep and steady, carrying an accent she could not quite place, something northern, something that spoke of colder, harder places than her own mountain village. "The road has been difficult, and night is coming quickly. I was hoping you might have room for a traveler in need of shelter." Every instinct told her to be cautious with strangers, especially now, especially after everything that had happened over the past month. Yet there was something in his eyes, a warm amber shade she recognized instantly though she could not immediately place why, that made her hesitation feel unnecessary. She stepped back from her door, gesturing him inside before she had fully decided to trust him. "You can stay by the fire," she said. "I don't have much, but I can share what I have." He introduced himself simply as Rowan, offering no further explanation of his origins, or his purpose in traveling through such a remote and unremarkable village. Ilara did not press him for details, sensing instinctively that he was a man accustomed to keeping his own counsel, and she had learned long ago that some questions were better left unasked, especially with strangers who might disappear the moment they felt too exposed. They shared a simple meal together that evening, and Ilara found herself surprised by how easily conversation flowed between them, despite his obvious guardedness. He asked careful questions about her life in the village, about her parents, about the small cabin she had built her life around, and though his questions seemed casual, she noticed the intensity with which he listened to every answer, as though committing each detail carefully to memory. In turn, she learned little about him beyond scattered impressions, a mention of responsibilities that weighed heavily on him, a reference to brothers he trusted with his life, a deep and obvious love for the mountains despite the danger they clearly held for him. He spoke of loyalty with a conviction that struck her as unusual for a simple traveler, and more than once, she caught him watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher, something between fascination and disbelief, as though he could hardly believe she was real. "You live here alone," he said at one point, not quite a question. "I do," she answered simply. "My parents passed a few years back. There wasn't anyone else." "That must be difficult," he said quietly, and something in his tone suggested he understood loss more intimately than his casual traveler's disguise allowed him to reveal. She found herself telling him more than she intended that night, about the loneliness of the winters, about the quiet ache of a life built entirely around survival, with little room left for anything else. He listened without judgment, without the pity she sometimes saw in the eyes of villagers who considered her situation unfortunate, and something about his quiet, steady attention made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely seen. He left the following morning, before she fully woke, leaving behind a small carved token, a wolf shaped from dark wood, resting on the table where they had shared their meal. She turned it over in her hands for a long moment, studying the careful craftsmanship, before tucking it into the pocket of her coat, unsure why she felt reluctant to set it aside. He returned 3 days later, and then again a week after that, always under the same guise of a traveler passing through, though Alara began to suspect the roads he claimed to travel bore little relation to any actual destination beyond her own door. She did not call attention to the pattern, though she found herself, against her better judgment, looking forward to his visits more than she was willing to admit, even to herself. Their conversations deepened with each meeting. He told her, carefully, of a world far larger and more complicated than her small village, of responsibilities that sometimes felt impossible to carry alone, of a role he had been born into, rather than chosen, one that demanded constant vigilance and left little room for simple things like this, sitting by a modest fire, sharing a modest meal, with someone who asked nothing of him beyond honest conversation. "You make it sound like a burden," she observed one evening, watching the firelight flicker across his sharp features. "It is," he admitted, "though lately it feels lighter than it used to." She felt heat rise in her cheeks at the weight behind his words, though she said nothing, unwilling to examine too closely the growing warmth she felt whenever he was near. Meanwhile, strange things continued happening around her small property, gifts of firewood and food appearing with the same careful precision as before, though now she began to notice 4 figures moving at the edges of her vision whenever Rowan visited, tall shadows that vanished the moment she turned to look directly at them. She mentioned it to him once, cautiously, watching his reaction closely. "Sometimes I feel like I'm being watched, even when you're the only one here." Something flickered across his expression, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "You're safer than you know," he said simply, offering no further explanation, though the certainty in his voice left little room for doubt. She should have pressed him further. She should have demanded answers about the strange coincidences piling steadily around her, about the timing of his visits with the disappearance of the mysterious wolves, about the way his eyes matched a shade of amber she had seen once before, under very different circumstances. Instead, she found herself choosing comfort over caution, choosing the warmth of his company over the cold clarity of unanswered questions, telling herself she would ask eventually, once she understood her own feelings a little better. Word of increasing unrest began drifting through the village around this time, whispers of tension building somewhere in the northern territories, rumors of rival packs testing old boundaries now that the Alpha King and his most trusted generals remained unaccounted for. The villagers spoke of these things distantly, as matters far removed from their small, quiet lives, unaware of how closely the threads of that distant conflict were beginning to wind around the humble cabin at the edge of their village. Alara noticed Rowan's visits growing shorter, his expression more troubled with each meeting, though he continued to deflect her gentle questions about what weighed so heavily on him. "It's nothing you need to worry about," he told her one evening, though the tension in his shoulders told a different story entirely. "You keep saying that," she replied, frustration finally breaking through her careful restraint. "But something is clearly wrong. I may not know exactly who you are, Rowan, but I know when someone is carrying more than they're willing to share." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "There are things about me I haven't told you," he admitted finally. "Things that would change how you see me, perhaps how you see everything that's happened between us these past weeks." Her heart pounded against her ribs. Part of her wanted to demand the truth immediately, to finally have the answers that had been circling just beyond her reach since the night of the storm. Another part of her, the quieter, more cautious part that had learned to survive through careful patience, told her that some truths revealed themselves only when the time was right, and that pushing too hard might shatter something fragile and precious before it had the chance to fully take shape. "Tell me when you're ready," she said softly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "I'm not going anywhere." Something in his expression shifted then, relief and gratitude, and something warmer still passing across his features, before he carefully composed himself once more. "Thank you," he said quietly, reaching out to briefly touch her hand, the contact brief but electric. Carrying a weight of unspoken meaning, neither of them was quite ready to voice aloud. He left again that night, disappearing into the darkness beyond her small clearing, and Alara stood in her doorway long after he had gone, watching the shadows between the trees, aware now more than ever that 4 other figures moved somewhere within that darkness, quietly, carefully, guarding something they clearly considered precious beyond measure. She did not yet know she was that something, though the truth was drawing steadily closer with each passing day, carried on winds that smelled increasingly of coming conflict. The unrest that villagers had spoken of, only in distant, careless whispers, arrived at Alara's doorstep with terrifying speed, one cold evening, nearly 2 months after the great storm. She had just finished securing her shutters against the wind when she heard it. A chorus of snarls and howls, far too close to her small clearing, carrying an aggression entirely unlike the careful, watchful presence she had grown accustomed to sensing at the edges of her property. She pressed herself against her door, heart pounding, straining to understand what was happening in the darkness beyond her walls. The sounds grew louder, closer, mixed now with something that sounded disturbingly like organized movement, coordinated rather than chaotic, the unmistakable signature of a deliberate attack, rather than a random encounter between wild animals. A heavy weight slammed against her door hard enough to rattle the frame, and she stumbled backward with a startled cry. Through the gap beneath her shutters, she caught flashes of movement, dark shapes locked in fierce combat, the glint of teeth and claws illuminated briefly by moonlight, before the shadows swallowed them again. She had never witnessed anything like it, the sheer scale and ferocity of creatures fighting with an intelligence and purpose that felt unmistakably deliberate. She grabbed the fire poker from beside her hearth, the only weapon she possessed, though she knew with grim certainty that it would offer little protection against whatever powerful forces were clashing just beyond her walls. Her mind raced through every possibility, wondering desperately whether Rowan was somewhere in that chaos, whether the 4 watchful shadows she had grown accustomed to sensing nearby were fighting for their lives at this very moment. The sounds of battle raged for what felt like an eternity, though it likely lasted only minutes. Then, abruptly, silence fell, heavy and absolute, broken only by her own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of her heart. She waited, frozen, uncertain whether the silence meant victory or something far worse. A soft knock sounded at her door, hesitant, almost apologetic despite the violence that had just unfolded outside. She approached cautiously, fire poker raised, and pulled the door open just enough to see who stood there. It was Rowan, though barely recognizable in the dim light. Blood soaked through a tear in his cloak, his expression tight with pain he was clearly trying to conceal, though the effort cost him visibly. Behind him stood 4 other figures she had never seen this closely before. Tall men, with the same watchful amber-tinted eyes she remembered from the wolves, who had once filled her small cabin, each of them bearing wounds of their own, from whatever battle had just taken place. "Rowan," she breathed, dropping the poker immediately and reaching for him without hesitation. "What happened? You're hurt." "We're fine," he said, though his voice carried a strain that contradicted his words entirely. "We need shelter, just for a short while, until we're certain the threat has passed." She did not hesitate, pulling the door wide and ushering all 5 men inside, despite the impossibly cramped space her small cabin offered. As she moved quickly to tend their wounds, gathering clean cloth and whatever herbs she had available for treating injuries, the pieces she had been carefully avoiding finally clicked together with undeniable clarity. 5 men, 5 wolves, the same amber eyes. The same protective, watchful presence that had surrounded her for months without explanation. She looked at Rowan as she cleaned a deep gash along his forearm, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear now, but from the overwhelming realization crashing over her. "You're them," she said quietly. "The wolves, from the storm. It was you." Rowan met her gaze steadily, no longer attempting to hide behind careful deflection. "Yes," he admitted. "It was us." The 4 other men remained quiet, watching the exchange with cautious attention, clearly waiting to see how she would respond to a truth that defied everything she understood about the natural world. She felt her mind reeling, struggling to reconcile the memory of 5 freezing wounded wolves with the 5 men now sitting in her cramped cabin, blood staining her floor, exhaustion etched deeply into features that somehow still carried an unmistakable echo of the creatures she had saved months earlier. "How is this possible?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are things in this world beyond what most people believe possible," Rowan said carefully. "My kind exists in secrecy for good reason. We live among humans without revealing our true nature, protecting the balance between our worlds. What you witnessed during the storm was not something we intended for you to see. We were injured, weakened beyond our ability to maintain our human forms. You saved us at our most vulnerable, when we had nothing left to offer in return but gratitude." She absorbed his words slowly, piecing together everything that had happened since that night, the mysterious gifts, the watchful shadows, his careful, deliberate visits under a traveler's disguise. "And you," she said, looking directly at him now, "you're not just one of them. You're something more, aren't you?" A flicker of something like nervousness crossed his features, unexpected on a man who had, until now, radiated quiet confidence in every interaction. "I am the Alpha King of the Northern Territories," he admitted finally. "These 4 men are my most trusted generals, bound to me by blood and loyalty since childhood. We were traveling through these mountains when a rival pack ambushed us during the height of the storm, leaving us wounded and stranded in wolf form, too weak to shift back or defend ourselves. You found us in our most desperate moment and chose kindness when you had every reason to choose fear instead." Alara sat back slowly, absorbing the full weight of what he was telling her. A king, not just any king, but a powerful ruler whose territory and influence, according to village whispers, stretched across regions far larger than she had ever imagined visiting. And she had wrapped him, unknowingly, in her mother's blanket, while he lay dying in the snow. "The attack tonight," she said slowly, working through the implications. "That was the rival pack you mentioned?" Rowan's expression darkened. "Yes. They have been testing our borders since our disappearance, believing us weakened, perhaps even dead. Tonight, they found us instead. And though we drove them back, they now know precisely where we have been hiding, and precisely who has been sheltering us." The weight of his words settled over her like a physical thing. "That means they know about me." "Yes," he said quietly, regret heavy in his voice. "I am sorry, Alara. I never intended to bring danger to your door. I only wanted to know you, to understand the woman who saved my life without asking anything in return. I did not consider carefully enough what my presence here might eventually cost you." She should have felt fear at his admission, should have demanded he leave immediately and take his danger with him, back to wherever powerful kings and rival packs belonged, far from her small, quiet life. Instead, she found herself reaching for his hand, steadying him as much as herself, feeling something settle deep within her chest despite the chaos of everything she had just learned. "You saved yourself that night too, in a way," she said softly. "You chose to trust me when you had every reason to fear discovery. That means something." He studied her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded in his expression. "Most people, upon learning what I truly am, react with far greater fear than you're showing right now. Most people probably haven't spent months getting to know you first," she replied simply. "I know the man who sat by my fire and listened when I spoke of my parents. I know the man who left a carved wolf on my table because he didn't know how else to say thank you. That man is still here, regardless of what form he takes." Something shifted powerfully in the room then, an understanding passing between them that needed no further words. The 4 generals exchanged quiet glances among themselves, clearly recognizing the significance of the moment, even as they remained respectfully silent, tending their own wounds while giving their king, and the woman before him, the space this revelation deserved. Outside, the night remained tense with the memory of violence recently past, and somewhere beyond the mountains, a rival pack now understood exactly where their greatest enemies had been hiding, and exactly what leverage they might use against them. The danger had only just begun, though for the first time since the storm, Alara found herself facing that danger not with fear, but with a fierce, unexpected resolve to protect what she had unknowingly built, piece by careful piece, since the night she chose to save 5 freezing strangers, rather than protect herself alone. Morning arrived pale and quiet, though the stillness felt fragile, the kind of calm that follows danger, rather than the kind that promises safety. Alara moved carefully around her small cabin, tending to the wounds of 5 men who had, until recently, existed in her memory only as 5 wolves she had saved during a desperate night. Rowan watched her work with quiet intensity, his own injuries healing with a speed that seemed impossible by human standards, though she supposed nothing about him could truly be measured by ordinary standards any longer. The 4 generals introduced themselves properly that morning, offering names that felt strangely formal against the intimacy of everything she had already witnessed between them. Edmund, the eldest and most serious, carried the scarred features she remembered from the largest of the 5 wolves. Callan, quieter and more watchful than the others, seemed to observe everything with careful calculation. Bennett, the youngest, offered her a warm, grateful smile despite his injuries, clearly the most openly emotional of the group. And Garrick, steady and quietly protective, positioned himself near the door throughout the morning, as though standing guard even while wounded. "We owe you a debt beyond measure," Edmund said formally, his voice carrying the weight of someone unaccustomed to expressing gratitude easily. "Few humans would have risked what you risked that night, for creatures they had every reason to fear." "I only did what felt right," Alara replied, uncomfortable with the weight of their collective gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Callan said quietly, his sharp eyes studying her with unsettling directness. "Anyone would not have. You understand very little yet of how rare true kindness is among those who have the power to withhold it safely." His words settled uncomfortably in her chest, though she pushed the discomfort aside, focusing instead on the practical matter of feeding 5 recovering men from stores meant to sustain 1 person through the remainder of a harsh winter. Rowan noticed her quiet calculation, and reached for her hand before she could protest. "You will not go without because of us," he said firmly. "Whatever you need, whatever this village needs, will be provided. That is not charity, Alara. That is simple justice, considering everything you have already given without asking for anything in return." She wanted to argue, some deeply ingrained pride resisting the idea of accepting help so readily, though she recognized the genuine sincerity behind his words, and allowed herself, finally, to accept assistance without the guilt that typically accompanied such offers. As the day progressed, the 5 men regained more of their strength, though tension remained ever present beneath their careful conversation, the memory of the previous night's attack lingering heavily over every interaction. "They will come again," Garrick said eventually, breaking a long silence that had settled over the group. "Now that they know where we've been hiding, and now that they've seen how badly weakened we still are, they will not wait long before attempting another attack." "How badly weakened exactly?" Alara asked, studying each of their faces carefully. Rowan hesitated before answering honestly. "Our injuries from the initial ambush during the storm were severe enough that full recovery has taken considerably longer than any of us anticipated. We are stronger now than we were, but not yet at full strength. Another significant attack, particularly one better coordinated than last night's, could prove genuinely dangerous." The implications of his admission settled heavily over the small cabin. If the rival pack attacked again before the king and his generals fully recovered, the consequences could extend far beyond this isolated mountain village, potentially destabilizing an entire territory that depended on Rowan's leadership for continued peace and protection. "Then we need a plan," Alara said firmly, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own resolve. "You can't simply wait here, vulnerable, hoping they don't return before you've healed." Bennett smiled slightly at her determination, though the expression carried genuine warmth rather than condescension. "She has more courage than most warriors twice her size." "I'm not offering courage," Alara replied. "I'm offering practicality. You need time to heal, and you need somewhere safer than this small cabin, somewhere that offers better defense if another attack comes." Edmund studied her thoughtfully. "The village itself offers little natural defense, and revealing our presence more broadly would only place additional innocent lives at risk should the rival pack decide to attack in force." "Then what about the old mill?" Alara suggested, an idea forming quickly as she spoke. "It sits at the edge of the forest, half abandoned now, but the stone walls are thick, and it backs against the cliffside, limiting how many directions an attack could come from. It's isolated enough that villagers rarely go there, which means fewer people at risk if trouble finds you." The 4 generals exchanged glances, clearly weighing the merit of her suggestion. Rowan studied her with an expression that mixed genuine surprise with growing admiration. "You know this territory well." "I've lived here my entire life," she said simply. "I know every inch of these mountains, every hidden place, and every weakness in the terrain. If you're going to defend yourselves properly, you'll need someone who understands this land as well as you understand combat." "Are you offering to help us prepare our defenses?" Callan asked, an edge of genuine curiosity in his otherwise guarded tone. "I'm offering to help protect people who protected me first, even before I fully understood what they were protecting me from," Ilara said firmly. "That includes helping however I can." Rowan opened his mouth, likely to protest the danger such involvement might bring her, but something in her expression stopped him before he could voice the objection. He recognized, perhaps more clearly than the others, the particular strength of will that had driven her out into a killing storm months earlier. The same strength that now refused to simply stand aside while danger threatened people she had come to care for deeply. "Very well," he said finally, though the reluctance in his voice remained evident. "But you will not place yourself in direct danger. Whatever role you play in preparing our defenses, you will remain protected throughout, regardless of what any of us must sacrifice to ensure it." She wanted to argue that point as well, though she recognized the fierce protectiveness behind his insistence, and chose, for now, to accept the compromise rather than fight a battle that would accomplish little beyond frustrating them both unnecessarily. Over the following days, the group relocated carefully to the old mill, moving supplies and reinforcing weakened sections of the stone structure under the cover of darkness to avoid drawing unwanted attention from the village. Ilara proved invaluable throughout the process, identifying hidden paths through the forest that would allow for quick escape if necessary, pointing out natural choke points that could be used defensively, and sharing knowledge of the terrain that even the generals, skilled as they were in combat, had never considered. As the days passed, her relationship with Rowan deepened steadily, forged now not just through quiet conversations by a small fire, but through shared purpose and mutual reliance during genuinely dangerous circumstances. He found himself confiding in her more openly than he had confided in anyone outside his closest circle in years, sharing the weight of leadership, the constant vigilance required to protect his people from threats both external and internal, the loneliness that came from being surrounded by loyal subjects, yet rarely finding anyone who saw him simply as a man, rather than a symbol of power. "You carry so much alone," she observed one evening, as they sat together near the mill's newly repaired hearth, while the generals kept careful watch outside. "Doesn't it exhaust you?" "Every day," he admitted quietly. "Until recently, I had grown accustomed to believing that exhaustion was simply the price of leadership, something to be endured rather than eased. Then a woman with more courage than sense dragged me out of a killing storm and reminded me that kindness could exist without expectation of anything in return." She felt heat rise in her cheeks at his words, though she held his gaze steadily. "I never expected any of this, you know. Not the gratitude, not the danger, and certainly not—" She trailed off, uncertain how to voice the feelings that had been building steadily within her since his very first visit under a traveler's disguise. "Certainly not this," he finished softly, reaching out to gently brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch lingering with obvious restraint. "Neither did I, Ilara. Yet here we are." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibility, before the sound of Garrick's voice calling urgently from outside shattered the fragile intimacy they had briefly shared. Both of them rose immediately, instincts sharpening at the tension evident in his tone, aware that whatever peace they had managed to carve out amid the chaos was, once again, about to be tested. Garrick stood at the edge of the tree line, tension radiating from every line of his posture, his sharp eyes fixed on something moving in the distance. "Riders," he said tersely as Rowan and Ilara approaching from the northern pass, moving fast. Rowan's expression hardened immediately, the warmth she had grown accustomed to seeing, replaced by the sharp focus of a leader assessing an approaching threat. "How many?" "6 that I can count, though there may be more concealed within the tree line," Garrick replied. "They carry no visible banner, but the formation suggests military training rather than simple travelers." Edmund and Callan joined them quickly, having heard the exchange from their posts around the mill's perimeter. Bennett remained slightly behind, his injuries still limiting his mobility more than the others despite the days of recovery. "It could be the rival pack testing our position again," Callan suggested, though his tone carried genuine uncertainty. Or it could be something else entirely. We won't know until they're close enough to identify, Rowan said firmly. Alara, I need you to remain inside the mill, out of sight, until we determine whether this is a threat. She wanted to argue, every instinct rebelling against the idea of hiding while danger approached, though she recognized the wisdom in his caution, and reluctantly retreated toward the mill's heavy wooden door. Before disappearing inside, she paused, watching as the 5 men positioned themselves strategically around the clearing, their earlier injuries seemingly forgotten in the face of immediate necessity. The riders emerged from the tree line minutes later, and Alara, watching carefully through a narrow gap in the mill's stone wall, felt her breath catch at the sight of them. They wore no obvious markings of hostility, their approach measured rather than aggressive, though the tension in Rowan's shoulders suggested he recognized something in their bearing that she could not identify from her limited vantage point. The lead rider dismounted first, and Alara recognized her immediately as the same sharp-eyed woman who had questioned her weeks earlier in the village, the one who had confirmed, with quiet certainty, that Alara had indeed saved 5 wolves during the great storm. Your Majesty, the woman said, bowing formally before Rowan, we have been searching for you since your disappearance. When we discovered evidence of last night's conflict, we feared the worst. Rowan's posture relaxed slightly, though caution remained evident in his expression. Commander Isolde, I take it the search has finally succeeded, though not without considerable delay. Forgive us, Your Majesty. The rival pack has been deliberately obscuring trails and spreading false information throughout the Northern Territories, making our search considerably more difficult than it should have been. We only recently uncovered reliable evidence pointing toward this location. As the conversation continued, Alara gradually understood that these riders were not enemies at all, but loyal soldiers from Rowan's own territory, finally locating their missing king after weeks of careful searching. Relief flooded through her, quickly followed by a fresh wave of uncertainty, as she considered what this discovery might mean for the fragile, private world she and Rowan had built together over the past weeks. She emerged from the mill cautiously, once it became clear the immediate danger had passed, drawing curious glances from the newly arrived soldiers, who clearly had not expected to find a human woman present at their king's location. Commander Isolde's sharp eyes settled on her immediately, recognition and calculation both evident in her expression. This is the woman from the village, Isolde said, though her tone suggested she was speaking as much to herself as to anyone else. The one who sheltered you during the storm. Yes, Rowan confirmed, moving to stand slightly closer to Alara, an unconscious gesture of protection that did not escape the commander's notice. Alara has continued providing invaluable assistance since our recovery began. Isolde studied the two of them for a long moment, her expression giving little away, before addressing Rowan directly. Your Majesty, while I am relieved beyond words to find you alive and recovering, I must inform you that your continued absence has created significant instability within your territory. The council has grown increasingly restless, and rumors of your possible death have emboldened certain factions who might otherwise have remained cautious. Rowan's expression darkened at this news, the weight of leadership settling visibly back onto his shoulders after weeks of relative freedom. How significant is this instability? Significant enough that immediate return is strongly advised, Isolde replied carefully. The council requires reassurance of your continued leadership, and several matters demand your direct attention that cannot be delayed further without risking genuine consequences for the stability of our territory. Alara felt a cold weight settle in her stomach as she listened to this exchange, understanding immediately what such news would mean. Rowan belonged to a world far larger and more demanding than the quiet mountain village that had sheltered him these past weeks. Whatever had grown between them during that time, however genuine and significant it felt, now faced the immediate pressure of responsibilities that could not simply be set aside. I understand, Rowan said finally, though the reluctance in his voice was unmistakable. He turned to Alara, his expression carrying an apology he had not yet voiced aloud. I need to address the situation within my territory immediately. The stability of my people, and the safety of countless lives, depends on my swift return. Of course, Alara said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the sudden ache spreading through her chest. You have responsibilities that matter far more than anything happening here. That's not true, Rowan said quietly, stepping closer despite the watching eyes of his soldiers and generals. What has happened here? matters more than you know, Alara. I do not wish to leave you, especially with the threat of another attack still looming over this village. We can provide additional protection for the village, while resolving matters within our own territory, Edmund offered, sensing his king's genuine distress. A contingent of guards could remain here, ensuring Alara's safety and the safety of her neighbors, while you address the situation that requires your immediate presence. Rowan considered this suggestion carefully before nodding. Yes. That would ease my concerns considerably, though it does little to ease the difficulty of this particular departure. He turned back to Alara, taking her hands gently in his despite the audience of soldiers and generals watching the exchange with varying degrees of curiosity and understanding. I will return, Alara. This is not an ending, whatever it might feel like in this moment. There are matters I must resolve, responsibilities I cannot simply abandon, but I promise you, this is not the last you will see of me. I believe you, she said softly, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she genuinely did. Whatever uncertainty lingered about the future they might share, she had witnessed enough of his character over these past weeks to trust the sincerity behind his promise. The departure that followed felt rushed and incomplete, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavily between them, as Rowan prepared to leave with Commander Isolde and the majority of his soldiers, while Edmund remained behind with a small contingent to ensure continued protection for both Alara and the vulnerable village nearby. The four generals exchanged brief, meaningful farewells with Alara, each expressing genuine gratitude for everything she had done during their recovery, before mounting their horses alongside their king. As Rowan turned his horse toward the northern pass, he looked back one final time, his expression carrying a promise that needed no further words to convey its sincerity. Then he was gone, disappearing into the tree line with his soldiers, leaving Alara standing once again at the edge of uncertainty, though this time, unlike the morning she had woken to find 5 wolves vanished without explanation, she carried with her the genuine belief that this separation would prove temporary rather than permanent. Still, as the days passed following his departure, that belief was tested repeatedly by the growing silence from the northern territories, and by whispers, carried once again through traveling merchants, of deepening conflict within Rowan's kingdom. Conflict that suggested his return home had brought him into far greater danger than any threat that had followed him to her quiet mountain village. 3 weeks passed without word from Rowan, and with each passing day, Alara found the silence growing heavier, harder to bear despite her determined efforts to focus on the practical demands of her ordinary life. Edmund and his small contingent of guards remained stationed discreetly near the village, ensuring her safety and the safety of her neighbors, though even their steady presence did little to ease the growing unease that had settled deep in her chest. She threw herself into work during those weeks, gathering firewood, mending her cabin's weakened walls before the last stretches of winter could exploit any vulnerability, trading at the village market with a determined focus that left little room for the constant worry threatening to overwhelm her quieter moments. Yet at night, alone in her small cabin, she found herself returning again and again to memories of amber eyes and quiet conversations, wondering whether the man who had promised his return was, at this very moment, fighting for his life within a conflict she could barely imagine. Edmund, sensing her growing distress despite her efforts to conceal it, began visiting her cabin more frequently, offering what reassurance he could without revealing details that might compromise the delicate political situation Rowan was navigating within his own territory. He is a formidable leader, Edmund told her, during one such visit, his scarred features softened slightly by obvious concern for her well-being. Whatever challenges he faces, he has overcome far greater obstacles throughout his reign. That doesn't make the waiting any easier, Alara admitted, staring into the modest fire crackling in her hearth. No, Edmund agreed. It rarely does. It was during one of these visits, nearly a month after Rowan's departure, that a rider arrived at her cabin, bearing urgent news that shattered whatever fragile calm she had managed to construct during the weeks of silence. The messenger, exhausted from hard travel, delivered his report directly to Edmund, though Alara caught enough fragments of the hushed conversation to understand that something significant, and clearly dangerous, had occurred within Rowan's territory. "What's happened?" she demanded, unable to bear the uncertainty a moment longer, once the messenger had finished speaking. Edmund hesitated, clearly weighing how much information to share, before finally meeting her determined gaze. The rival pack that attacked us here has allied with a faction within Rowan's own council, factions that grew restless during his absence and have now moved to challenge his authority directly. There has been an attempt on his life. The words hit her like a physical blow. Is he alive? Yes, Edmund confirmed quickly, seeing the color drain from her face. Wounded, but alive. However, the situation remains extremely volatile. Those responsible for the attempt have not yet been fully identified or contained, and Rowan's position, while not immediately threatened, remains precarious until the conspiracy is fully uncovered. Alara's mind raced through the implications of this news, fear and fierce protectiveness warring within her chest in equal measure. I need to go to him. That is not wise, Edmund said carefully. The situation within the territory remains dangerous, particularly for someone connected to Rowan whose identity is not yet widely known among his people. Revealing your existence during such an unstable moment could create additional complications, potentially even additional danger, for both you and Rowan himself. I understand the risk, Alara said firmly, her earlier fear hardening into fierce resolve. But I cannot simply remain here, safely distant, while he faces danger alone. He came to my aid when I asked for nothing. I will not abandon him now, regardless of the risk involved. Edmund studied her for a long moment, something like respect mixing with his obvious concern. You possess remarkable courage, Alara, though courage alone will not be sufficient protection within the political complexities you would be entering. Then teach me what I need to know, she replied without hesitation. You've spent weeks teaching me to understand this terrain for defensive purposes. Teach me now what I need to understand about the political landscape I would be entering, so that my courage isn't simply reckless, but informed. Something shifted in Edmund's expression, a decision crystallizing behind his sharp eyes. Very well. If you are truly determined to make this journey, I will accompany you myself, along with sufficient guards to ensure your safety throughout the travel. However, you must understand that once we arrive, the situation will require careful navigation. Rowan's enemies will not hesitate to use any perceived vulnerability against him, and your presence, however genuine your intentions, could be perceived as exactly such a vulnerability, if not handled with appropriate caution. I understand, Alara said, though privately she wondered whether she truly grasped the full complexity of what awaited her within Rowan's territory. Whatever uncertainty remained, however, her resolve did not waver. She spent the following days preparing carefully under Edmund's guidance, learning essential details about the political structure of Rowan's kingdom, the key figures likely to support or oppose her presence, and the careful diplomatic language required when navigating a world so vastly different from the simple mountain village she had always called home. The journey north proved arduous, spanning nearly a week through increasingly rugged and unfamiliar terrain, the mountains growing sharper and more forbidding with each passing day. Edmund and his guards remained vigilant throughout, aware that the political instability plaguing Rowan's territory might extend its reach even to this remote stretch of wilderness. Alara found herself grateful for their protection, though the physical demands of the journey tested her endurance in ways her quiet village life had never required. They arrived finally at the edge of Rowan's territory, on a cold, gray morning, and Alara found herself unprepared for the sheer scale of what awaited her. Where she had imagined perhaps a larger version of her own modest village, she instead found herself gazing upon an expansive settlement built into the mountainside itself, structures of stone and timber rising in careful, deliberate formation, populated by countless individuals, moving with the particular grace and watchfulness she now recognized as characteristic of Rowan's kind. This is his territory, she breathed, genuinely awed by the scale of what she was witnessing. This is only the outer settlement, Edmund replied. The true seat of power lies further within the mountain itself, protected by generations of careful fortification. Rowan's people have thrived here for centuries, maintaining their independence and safety through exactly this kind of careful, deliberate strength. As they moved deeper into the settlement, Alara became increasingly aware of the curious glances directed her way, whispers following in their wake as word spread quickly of a human woman traveling under Edmund's direct protection. She kept her expression carefully composed, despite the mounting scrutiny, remembering Edmund's careful instruction about maintaining dignity and confidence, regardless of the uncertainty she genuinely felt. They were met partway through the settlement by Commander Isolde, whose sharp expression carried visible surprise at Alara's unexpected arrival. "Edmund, this is unexpected." "Circumstances required it," Edmund replied simply. "How does the king fare?" "Recovering, though the conspiracy against him remains only partially unraveled," Isolde said, her gaze shifting toward Alara with an unreadable expression. "His Majesty will likely wish to know of your arrival immediately, given recent developments." She led them swiftly through the settlement, toward the mountain's interior, and Alara felt her heart pounding, with a mixture of anticipation and fear, as they approached what could only be the seat of Rowan's power. Aware that whatever awaited her within those ancient stone walls would likely determine not just the fate of her relationship with him, but potentially the stability of an entire kingdom, now watching closely to see how their wounded king would navigate both political conspiracy and matters of the heart simultaneously. The chamber where they finally found Rowan felt both grand and strangely intimate, carved directly into the mountain stone, yet warmed by a fire large enough to heat the entire space comfortably. He sat propped against a carved wooden chair, bandages visible beneath his partially open shirt, his expression tired but alert as Isolde announced their arrival. The moment his eyes found Alara standing in the doorway, every trace of exhaustion seemed to momentarily fall away, replaced by an expression of such genuine surprise and relief that her own carefully maintained composure nearly broke entirely. "Alara," he breathed, attempting to rise despite his obvious injuries, only to be stopped by a firm hand from Bennett, who had been tending his wounds nearby. "What are you doing here? This territory remains far too dangerous for you." "I heard what happened," she said, moving quickly to his side, despite Isolde's obvious discomfort with the breach of formal protocol. "I couldn't simply remain safely distant while you faced this alone." "You should not have come," he said, though the fierce protectiveness in his tone was undercut by the way his hand immediately reached for hers, gripping tightly, as though reassuring himself of her genuine presence. "The conspiracy against me remains unresolved. Your presence here creates additional complications, additional risk." "Then let me help resolve it," Alara replied firmly. "I did not survive dragging 5 wolves through a killing storm simply to abandon you now, when the danger has grown more complicated rather than less." Something in her fierce determination seemed to ease the tension in his shoulders slightly, though concern remained evident in his expression. Edmund stepped forward then, addressing the room with the careful authority of someone accustomed to navigating delicate political situations. "Your Majesty, while I understand the risk her presence creates, I believe she may also offer something valuable that has been missing from our efforts to identify the remaining conspirators." "Explain," Rowan said, curiosity mixing with his obvious concern. "She possesses an outsider's perspective, unclouded by the political alliances and rivalries that have complicated our internal investigation thus far," Edmund continued. "Additionally, her demonstrated loyalty and courage during our recovery period suggests she may prove more capable of navigating this situation than we initially assumed." Isolde, who had remained skeptically silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke. "There is truth in what Edmund suggests, though the risk remains significant. The conspirators have already attempted violence against our king directly. They will not hesitate to use any vulnerability, including this woman's presence, against him, if given the opportunity." "Then we ensure I am not simply a vulnerability," Alara said, meeting Isolde's sharp gaze directly. "I understand the risk. I am not asking for protection at the cost of usefulness. I am asking to genuinely help, in whatever capacity proves most valuable." Rowan studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing his fierce desire to protect her against the practical wisdom of accepting help during a genuinely dangerous political crisis. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very well. But you will remain under constant guard, and any involvement in the investigation will proceed only with careful caution." Over the following days, Alara found herself drawn steadily into the complicated political landscape of Rowan's kingdom, attending careful, guarded discussions with council members whose loyalties remained uncertain, observing interactions between various factions with the same careful attention she had once applied to reading the subtle signs of an approaching mountain storm. Her outsider status, rather than proving a liability as Isolde had initially feared, instead allowed her to notice inconsistencies and tensions that those deeply embedded within the political structure had grown too accustomed to seeing clearly. It was during one such observation, nearly a week into her stay, that she noticed something significant. A council member named Alaric, who had publicly expressed unwavering loyalty to Rowan throughout every formal discussion, consistently avoided direct eye contact whenever conversations turned toward the specific timeline of the assassination attempt. More telling still, she observed him engaging in quiet, private conversations with individuals from the rival pack whenever he believed himself unobserved, conversations that ended abruptly whenever anyone approached. She brought her observations to Edmund and Callan carefully, aware that accusing a prominent council member without solid evidence could prove disastrous if her suspicions proved unfounded. "I could be wrong," she admitted, "but something about his behavior feels deliberately deceptive." Callan's sharp eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Alaric has long been considered one of the king's most trusted advisors. If your suspicions prove correct, this would represent a betrayal of the deepest kind. Which is precisely why he would make an effective conspirator," Edmund observed grimly. "No one would think to suspect him, given his long history of apparent loyalty." They proceeded carefully from there, quietly gathering additional evidence over the following days, watching Alaric's movements and communications with the same patient vigilance Alara had once used to track wolf prints through fresh mountain snow. The evidence, once assembled, proved damning beyond reasonable doubt. Alaric had indeed been coordinating secretly with the rival pack, providing them with detailed information about Rowan's movements and vulnerabilities in exchange for promises of increased power once the rival pack successfully seized control of the territory. The confrontation that followed, when Rowan finally revealed the full extent of the uncovered conspiracy before his assembled council, proved as dramatic as it was necessary for restoring stability to his fractured leadership. Alaric, faced with undeniable evidence of his betrayal, initially attempted denial, before finally, upon realizing the futility of continued deception, revealing the names of additional conspirators who had similarly been working to undermine Rowan's authority during his extended absence. "You built this network of betrayal, believing me weak, believing my extended absence meant vulnerability rather than temporary recovery," Rowan said, his voice carrying a controlled fury that silenced the entire chamber. "You were wrong on both counts, and your betrayal ends today, before it can cause any further harm to the people I have sworn to protect." The subsequent removal of Alaric and his fellow conspirators from positions of power, followed by careful negotiations to ensure continued stability among the remaining council members, took several additional days to fully resolve. Throughout this process, Alara remained close to Rowan's side, offering quiet support and careful counsel whenever her outsider perspective proved useful, gradually earning genuine respect from council members and generals alike, who had initially viewed her presence with skepticism, bordering on outright suspicion. It was during a quiet moment following the conspiracy's final resolution, as the immediate crisis finally began settling into manageable order, that Rowan drew her aside privately, his expression carrying a seriousness that made her breath catch with sudden uncertainty. "You have done more for my kingdom in these past weeks than many advisors accomplish in years of service," he said quietly. "You risked genuine danger, navigated a political landscape entirely foreign to you, and helped uncover a betrayal that might otherwise have festered indefinitely, causing far greater harm before eventually being discovered." "I did what felt necessary," she replied simply, "the same as I did during the storm." "Yes," he agreed, reaching for her hands with obvious tenderness. "The same fierce, selfless courage that first drew me to you months ago, unaware at the time of how deeply that courage would eventually shape both our lives." He hesitated, something vulnerable crossing his features despite his position of considerable power. "Alara, everything that has happened since that storm has convinced me of something I did not expect to feel again after so many years, focused entirely on duty and responsibility. I love you, and I wish for you to remain here, at my side, not simply as a guest or an advisor, but as my queen, if you are willing to accept both the honor and the considerable challenges such a position would bring." The declaration, so direct and unguarded after weeks of carefully controlled political tension, left Alara momentarily speechless, her heart pounding with an overwhelming rush of emotion she had been carefully containing since first realizing the depth of her feelings for him weeks earlier. back when he had still been nothing more than a mysterious traveler sharing quiet conversations by her modest fire. For a long moment, Alara said nothing at all, overwhelmed by the enormity of what Rowan was offering her. She thought of her small cabin, the quiet, difficult life she had built alone since her parents' passing, the modest existence she had always assumed would be the entirety of her future. She thought of the mountain village that had shaped every part of who she was, the neighbors who had known her since childhood, the simple rhythms of survival that had defined her days for as long as she could remember. Then she thought of the storm, of 5 freezing wolves who had needed her help without asking for it, of the way she had chosen kindness without hesitation despite every reasonable fear that should have stopped her. She thought of Rowan's quiet visits afterward, of conversations that had gradually revealed a man far more complex and genuine than his powerful position might have suggested, of the fierce protectiveness and equally fierce vulnerability he had shown her throughout their unlikely connection. "I never imagined a life like this for myself," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I never imagined kings, or conspiracies, or creatures that could shift between wolf and man. I certainly never imagined falling in love with someone whose responsibilities extend across an entire kingdom, rather than a single small cabin." "I understand if the weight of such responsibility feels overwhelming," Rowan said carefully, though genuine fear flickered behind his controlled expression. "I would never ask you to accept this life, if it meant sacrificing everything that makes you who you are." "That's not what I'm saying," Alara interrupted gently, reaching up to cup his face with genuine tenderness. "I'm saying that despite everything unexpected, everything that should feel impossible or overwhelming, being here, helping resolve this conspiracy, standing beside you through genuine danger, has felt more meaningful than anything I've experienced in my entire life. I'm not afraid of the responsibility, Rowan. I'm only afraid of not being enough to meet it properly." "You have already proven more than enough," he said firmly, relief flooding through his expression. "You uncovered a betrayal that experienced advisors failed to notice for months. You showed courage during genuine danger that many trained warriors would struggle to match. Whatever uncertainty you feel about your readiness for this role, know that I have witnessed nothing but strength and wisdom from you since the very night you saved my life." "Then yes," Alara said, her heart finally settling into the certainty that had been building steadily throughout their conversation. "Yes, I will remain here, at your side, as your queen, for as long as you'll have me." The joy that spread across Rowan's features in response to her answer erased every trace of the exhaustion and tension that had marked his recovery from both physical injury and political betrayal. He pulled her close, and their embrace carried the weight of everything they had endured together since that first desperate night in the storm. Every careful conversation, every moment of danger faced side by side, every quiet realization that what had begun as simple gratitude had grown into something far deeper and more permanent. Word of their engagement spread quickly throughout the settlement, and Alara found herself surprised by the genuine warmth with which most of Rowan's people received the news. Whatever initial skepticism had greeted her arrival as an unknown human woman had largely dissolved during the weeks of the conspiracy investigation, replaced by growing respect for her demonstrated courage and clear devotion to their king's well-being. Bennett, in particular, seemed genuinely delighted by the announcement, teasing Rowan gently about finally finding happiness after years of solitary duty, while Callan offered his characteristically measured but sincere congratulations, and Garrick simply nodded with quiet approval that carried its own significant weight, given his typically reserved nature. Preparations began almost immediately for a formal ceremony that would serve dual purposes, celebrating both Rowan's engagement and the successful resolution of the recent conspiracy, offering his people a clear symbol of renewed stability and hope following weeks of uncertainty and fear. Alara found herself swept into a whirlwind of preparation entirely foreign to anything she had previously experienced, learning formal customs and traditions specific to Rowan's kingdom, meeting additional council members and prominent figures whose support would prove essential for her successful transition into her new role. Throughout this preparation, she made a point of returning periodically to her small mountain village, ensuring her former neighbors understood the genuine happiness she had found, while also working alongside Edmund and Rowan to establish permanent, formal protections for the village that had unknowingly played such a pivotal role in reshaping the future of an entire kingdom. Additional guards were stationed there permanently. Resources were allocated generously to support the village's continued growth and prosperity, and a formal alliance was established, recognizing the village's unique connection to the kingdom's royal family. Her small cabin, rather than being abandoned entirely, was carefully preserved, a quiet reminder of where this remarkable journey had truly begun. She visited it occasionally throughout the following weeks, standing in the small space that had once contained 5 freezing wounded wolves, remembering the fear and determination that had driven her out into that killing storm, marveling at how completely that single decision had reshaped the entire trajectory of her life. The day of the formal ceremony arrived nearly 2 months after Rowan's initial proposal. The mountain settlement transformed, with careful decoration and genuine celebration that reflected the deep relief and hope felt throughout the territory, following the successful resolution of recent political turmoil. Alara stood before the assembled crowd, dressed in garments far finer than anything she had ever previously worn, her heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and overwhelming joy as she prepared to formally accept her role, not just as Rowan's wife, but as queen and protector of an entire kingdom. As part of the ceremony, in a gesture that brought genuine tears to her eyes, Rowan presented her with a formally mounted display, containing the same worn blanket she had once wrapped around his freezing body during that desperate night in the storm, now preserved permanently within the Great Hall, as a lasting symbol of the compassion and courage that had first brought them together. Beside it hung a formal proclamation, carefully inscribed, declaring that compassion and kindness, regardless of the risk they might carry, would forever be honored as the truest measure of strength within the kingdom, a lesson learned through the unlikely story of a woman who had shared her last blanket with 5 frozen strangers, unaware they belonged to the very king she would one day help lead. As the formal ceremony concluded and celebration began in earnest throughout the settlement, Alara found herself standing beside Rowan, surrounded by the 4 generals who had become genuine friends throughout this remarkable journey, gazing out over a kingdom that had once felt entirely foreign, but now felt, undeniably, like home. She thought of the frightened, uncertain woman who had stumbled through a killing storm months earlier, driven by nothing more than simple compassion for suffering creatures she barely understood, and marveled at how far that single act of kindness had carried her. "Any regrets?" Rowan asked quietly, watching her expression carefully as the celebration continued around them. "None," she answered immediately, genuine certainty carrying through every word. "Though I imagine my mother would find it rather remarkable that her blanket ended up displayed in a royal hall, rather than keeping me warm through another ordinary winter." Rowan smiled, pulling her closer as the sounds of celebration filled the mountain air around them. Perhaps she would find it equally remarkable that her daughter's simple act of kindness ultimately saved an entire kingdom, restored stability to a fractured leadership, and brought genuine happiness to a man who had long since given up hope of finding it. Alara leaned into him, watching the joyful celebration unfolding throughout the settlement she now called home, and felt, with complete and unshakable certainty, that every difficult choice, every moment of fear and uncertainty that had led her to this point, had been entirely worth the remarkable journey it had ultimately provided. The storm that had once threatened to end her life had instead given her a new one, richer and more meaningful than anything she could have previously imagined, built upon the simple, powerful truth that compassion, freely given without expectation of return, possessed the power to reshape not just individual lives, but the very course of destiny itself.